view in terms of the federal election landscape is, control of the House and control of the Senate, obviously, in the midterms, the administration. We've had total gridlock, as you are well aware, for the last 3 years, as long as we've had divided government. And so I think that there's hope that one way or another that we'll be able to start to move to get things done. And the primary way that most people see of that happening is either the Democrats taking over the House or the Republicans taking over the Senate. In terms of the first option, the Democrats taking over the House, I see, and I think most others see, that as close to being impossible. Currently, the Democrats would need to pick up 17 seats to be able to take control. They've had two members that have represented very, very heavily Republican districts, Matheson in Utah and McIntyre in North Carolina, who have both denounced retirements. Both of those seats are expected to go Republican. And so, in essence, they really need to pick up about 19 seats. With a president whose approval rating is in the low 40s, that's very, very difficult under any set of circumstances. With the landscape as it is, Charlie Cook has, of his toss-up seats, only 3 are held by Republicans, 11 are held by Democrats. So, with only 3 truly competitive Republican seats in the balance and 11 on the Democrat side, they would need to win all of their competitive seats. They would need to hold all of their competitive seats, plus pick up 19 additional Republican seats, which, again, in the current environment, I think is reasonably impossible to envision unless there's some sort of political earthquake between now and Election Day. So the more interesting scenario is on the Senate side, and if the Republicans have the opportunity to take over the Senate. Currently, I think that they do. The numbers to remember on the Senate side, at least in terms of the Republicans having the opportunity to take over, are 3, 6, 9, and 12. 6 is the number of seats that the Republicans would need to pick up to be able to gain the majority. 3 is how many they essentially kind of have in the bag. There are 3 seats that are currently held by Democrat members who are retiring, so they're open seats. And all 3 of those, they're very, very heavily Republican states. All 3 of those have the Republicans recruited their first choice candidate, who is very well funded and currently has a 10+ point lead in the polls. Those are South Dakota, West Virginia, and Montana. And we'll look at some of those in just a second. But there's 3 that Republicans are pretty assured to pick up. So 3, 6, 9, and 12. They need to pick up 3 additional ones, and they have 9 places that they're looking to do that. 9 target seats that the Republicans have to pick up the additional 3 that they would need to take over control. And with those first, there's 12 seats total that the Republicans are targeting to take over from the Democrats. Obviously, I think very few people anticipate that they would win all 12, but I think the likelihood of them winning 3 of the 9, at least according to the current polling, the current political landscape, where some of those seats and some of those races are taking place, I think it's probably reasonably likely that the Republicans would pick up 3 of those 9 to be able to gain control. That said, Republicans certainly have a very clear recent history of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, so I wouldn't put anything in the bag for them at this point. Looking through some of the races in that 12, the Democrats have 2 seats that they feel like they have the opportunity to be on offense. Neither are slam dunks for them, the way that some of the Republican challenger seats are. But they're looking at Georgia and Kentucky, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more depth in a little bit. But those are 2 seats that the Democrats feel like they have an opportunity to pick up a currently Republican-held seat. And both of them are actually legitimately real opportunities. It's not even though it's Georgia and it's Kentucky, both of which are states that have gone fairly reliably Republican over the last number of presidential elections, the dynamics at play with the candidates involved and everything else make it a situation that's a real possibility on the Democrat side, and we'll get to those in a second. Looking through the 12 Republican targets, one of the first on anybody's list of competitive seats is in Louisiana. Mary Landrieu is the Democrat incumbent. She is being challenged. The way that Louisiana does their primary is a little bit different than most places. They have what's called a jungle primary. California has a similar system. A couple of other states do, where everybody, regardless of party, runs on the same ballot, and the top 2 vote getters, again regardless of party, go to a runoff, which is essentially like the general election. In certain districts, you end up with 2 Republicans in the runoff, and in some districts you end up with 2 Democrats in the runoff. Typically you end up with 1 of each, because everybody votes on the same ballot in the primary. But here, if she's able to top 50%, there are two Republicans running, Cassidy and Manis. If they were to split the Republican vote enough such that it was a 42% for Cassidy and some smaller amount for Manis, and Landrieu were able to get over 50%, then she would just automatically become reelected. In all likelihood, most of the current polling has both of them under 50%, and so nobody would be elected on the initial ballot, with only 3 people running, which is a little bit unusual. That still is a possibility, though. And Representative Congressman Bill Cassidy is the leading Republican in that race. He currently has a lead in most current polls. It is a situation where the business community is very, very split. Outside of Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Mary Landrieu is probably the most pro-business Democrat in the Senate. And so a lot of BIPAC members are working to support her reelection, especially people in the oil and gas industry. She was recently named chair of the Energy Committee in the Senate. And so you can imagine if you are BP or Exxon or Chevron or whoever else has oil and gas interests, you're not going to go against the sitting energy chairman, especially when it's somebody that you've had a pretty good relationship with over the years. So my sense is that of all of the competitive seats, that Landrieu is probably the one most likely to hold on and win re-election. But it's a very heavily Republican state. Cassidy is leading in the polls at this point. Both of them are going to have plenty of money. There's going to be an enormous amount of outside spending on both sides. But that's going to be one of, in my opinion, probably the most competitive races, and probably one of the places that I see the Democrat having the best shot of holding on amongst some of the most competitive ones that we're going to talk about. The next one is Pryor in Arkansas, again another very heavily Republican state at the presidential level. Pryor has also worked hard to position himself as a pro-business, moderate-oriented Democrat. He has a clear primary and is running against a Republican with a clear primary, Congressman Tom Cotton. Again, there the business community is a little bit split. He's not as pro-business in his orientation as Landrieu, but still it's a conservative state. It's a Republican-leaning state, and so he's done a pretty good job of positioning himself in that sense. That is one that this is from the beginning of March. Most of the polling that I've seen in this race has Cotton up by 5 to 8 points. A lot of people feel like Pryor has not distinguished himself in any significant way in the Senate. This is one that is, my sense is that Pryor will probably end up losing this seat, and that'll be one of the other pickup opportunities for the Republicans. But it's not all the way done, and Arkansas does have a history, certainly, of electing Democrats at the state level. I mean, they've elected Pryor, they elected Blanche Lincoln for a number of years. The governor is a Democrat in Arkansas, even though the state went almost 20 points for Romney in the presidential election. So they do have a history of party splitting outside of the presidential level. Alaska is another that's at the top of everybody's competitive race list. Incumbent Democrat Mark Bejic won with 48% in a strange election a couple of years ago. There was a write-in candidate, and he ended up getting 48% when he won. There's a contested primary on the Republican side. Meade Treadwell is the current lieutenant governor. Dan Sullivan is the former Department of Natural Resources commissioner. Sullivan has done a better job on the fundraising front. Treadwell has better name ID as the current elected statewide official. Joe Miller was the person who ended up with the nomination in 2010 as a Tea Party candidate. He has since faded in the estimation both of the eyes of the party and broadly around the state. While he will still play some role in the primary, I don't think that anybody gives him a reasonable shot of actually winning the nomination. If he does, I think Bejic is pretty well assured of re-election. against either Treadwell or Sullivan. It's pretty much a toss-up. The business community there is reasonably split between Sullivan and Treadwell. A lot of the Washington business communities tended to go towards Sullivan. The business community on the ground in Alaska likes both, has a good relationship with both, and would be comfortable with either one. BIPAC, meanwhile, again, because of the heavy oil and gas presence in Alaska, has worked hard to be friendly at least to that industry. So it's a competitive race. Most of the polling that I've seen in the primary has Treadwell and Sullivan tied, and then either one of them running against BIPAC is essentially a toss-up and tied at this point as well. Kay Hagan in North Carolina, the fourth state that went for Romney, that is being represented by an incumbent Democrat who's running for re-election. Tom Tillis is the Republican House Speaker there. BIPAC has gone ahead and endorsed Tillis at the recommendation of our state partner there, the North Carolina Chamber, and a number of our members who have substantial operations in that state. Tillis has not only been a friend and helpful to the business community, he's really sort of been a champion for them there, making sure that their bills get sponsored, making sure that they get through committee, that they get votes and those sorts of things. And so very, very strong proponent of the business community in North Carolina during his time as Speaker. Hagan, of those four members, Landrieu, Pryor, BIPAC, and Hagan has certainly been the least supportive of the business community of those four. The thing that works in her advantage in this case is that North Carolina is the most purple of the states, in which that's sort of a scenario that was still a Romney state represented by a Democrat. Her approval ratings are pretty low. The president's approval ratings in North Carolina are abysmal. And Tillis has a contested primary. Greg Bannon is a kind of Tea Party oriented physician in North Carolina. Most of the polling that I've seen there has Tillis 10 to 15 points ahead, so it's enough that you can feel okay about it. But in a southern state Republican primary, that's always something to be aware of. But I feel comfortable that Tillis would probably end up as the nominee, and if he does, my sense is that he'll probably win the general election as well. This is one of the slam dunk states for the Republicans, West Virginia, where Senator Rockefeller is retiring. Shillimore Capito is the current member of Congress there, running against Natalie Tennant, who is the Secretary of State. Capito is ahead by 10 to 15 points, depending on which poll you look at. She has a sterling business record in the House. It's a state that went for Romney by over 20 points, and especially some of the, and I'm sure you guys are as familiar with this as they are. Some of the administration's attacks on the coal industry play an enormous role there. So the president's approval ratings, are horrible in West Virginia, largely based on the coal issue, but some other things as well. It's a fairly culturally conservative state, even though they've had a history of electing some Democrats, such as Joe Manchin, like we mentioned, probably the most pro-business Democrat in the Senate. But this is one that, as an open seat, Capito has pretty much statewide name ID there. She's very well regarded in the state, and it's a good political landscape for her. Pretty confident that Capito is going to be the next senator there. And let's take a look at some of these other kind of groupings first. South Dakota, one of the other slam dunk states. Mike Rounds is the former governor, is the Republican candidate. He does have a primary with a couple of Tea Party oriented candidates, but is pretty comfortably ahead at this point, both in terms of name ID, in terms of fundraising, and any of the polling that's been out has him, a good solid 20, 25 points ahead in the primary battle. He's running against Rick Weiland, who is a former FEMA director. He had been an aide to Tom Daschle, former senator from there during Daschle's time in the Senate. And Rounds, as you can see, is up by about 20 points in the general election. Again, a Democrat-held seat that's now open, that is almost assuredly to go Republican unless there's some kind of a mess up there. Montana is the third that is pretty assuredly switching sides. Senator Baucus there retired. That's spelled incorrectly at the top. Forgive it. But he retired to become ambassador to China. This is a little bit tricky because John Walsh, who was the lieutenant governor, was appointed to fill the remainder of the term, and so as an incumbent senator now, has the opportunity to do some fundraising, the opportunity to position himself on issues, either in alignment with or in opposition to the administration. So it gives him an opportunity to kind of raise his profile and demonstrate independence. Even still, Steve Daines, the U.S. congressman, Montana is a single congressional seat state, so he's been elected statewide already. Has a record that is well liked in the state. Had a pretty substantially. This is polling is from late January, but I haven't seen anything recently that's any significantly different. So in all likelihood, Steve Daines is going to graduate from the House to the Senate there in Montana. That's the third, sort of slam dunk seat for the Republicans. Going back a little bit, 2 Democrat-held open seats that were in states that were carried by the president, Iowa and Michigan. Fairly different outlooks here. One thing about the Democrats at this cycle is they have been enormously disciplined in clearing primary fields for their chosen candidates. In none of these races that we're going to go through is there a seriously contested Democrat primary. In every single case, either it's a Democrat incumbent senator or they've cleared the field for their chosen candidate, which is one of the advantages of having, administration of the same party. Is that, for those on the Republican side, you probably remember when Karl Rove could make a call to the state party or whoever and say, we don't want to have a primary there, and all of a sudden a primary would disappear. So the same thing is kind of happening on the Democrat side now. So they have been very, very disciplined in terms of keeping an open primary field for their chosen candidates. In this case, it's Bruce Braley, who is a congressman. Republicans have a crowded primary. The 3 top candidates are Joni Ernst, who's a state senator, Matt Whitaker's former U.S. attorney, and Mark Jacobs is the former CEO of Reliant Energy, so a big corporate CEO. The business community there, as you can imagine, is split. Even within BIPAC's board, we have people who are split. We have some who are supporting Jacobs, some who are supporting Ernst, who did have a very good relationship with the business community during her time in the state Senate. Some feel like having her as a female candidate could be a better matchup against a Democrat in a state that has kind of leaned Democrat, certainly over the last several years. But that is a tough primary. Jacobs has had the opportunity to put some of his own money into the race and has kind of dribbled it in so far. I think everybody sort of expected him to put a big marker out and kind of help buy the primary. He has not done that so far. Whether he does going forward remains to be seen, but so far it's a pretty tight primary between Ernst, Whitaker, and Jacobs. There are a handful of Tea Party-oriented candidates that are running as well that can complicate things and change some of the vote structure. Currently, Braley has a lead over any of them. It is a Democrat-leaning state. Braley, is a pretty well-liked member there. My guess is that this is one that probably ends up staying in the Democrats' hands. But it is on the radar. There are some good Republicans running. It'll be a competitive race that both sides pay attention to and spend money on. My guess is that this one probably ends up staying Democrat. Michigan, which is a more heavily Democrat state at the presidential level, is dead even in the polls. There's Terry Lynn Land, who is a former Secretary of State, running against Gary Peters, who is a member of Congress from the Detroit area. It's an open seat. Current polling, like I said, has a dead even or Land ahead by a few points. She has done a good job fundraising. She has some of her own personal money that she's already invested in the campaign and has indicated that she intends to do more. Peters is a somewhat uninspiring Democrat. He's not, way out of line with standard Democrat orthodoxy, certainly for Michigan. But he's not a terribly inspiring sort of figure either. So that's a race that the Republicans see a real opportunity of picking up a Democrat-held seat. my estimation is that that's going to be a very, very close race, and at this point, I would guess that that's going to switch to the Republicans. But I think it'll be a really close one for them to watch. Colorado, Udall picked up a challenger in Cory Gardner about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. Gardner is a member of Congress. This is one that has just come on people's radar when Gardner announced. Before that, there had not been a significant challenger on the Republican side. He got in, has already cleared the primary field for himself, and within a week and a half, polling has it within a 1-point race. Nobody's run a single TV ad. He hasn't, done his campaigning around the state. Udall is polling, and I'm not sure of all the reasons for this, but Udall has consistently had very, very soft support in Colorado since his election, and Gardner is a relatively young, I would guess, mid-40s, kind of sharp, hard-charging young guy with a pretty mainstream record. The business community there is very supportive. BIPAC endorsed him when he ran for Congress in a swing district there 2 years ago, and so something that we have not issued an endorsement yet, but I expect that we will. The state business community is a big fan of his, and has had kind of some run-ins with Udall over the years. So that's going to be one that is on everybody's radar going forward. Which one am I missing?
Kentucky.
Yeah, so those are, New Hampshire, because that has just come on. Scott Brown, former senator of Massachusetts, announced a exploratory committee and is expected to go ahead and announce his official candidacy relatively soon in New Hampshire against Jeanne Shaheen, who polling doesn't have that as him, with him being significantly close yet, but he's a respected candidate. He has a national fundraising operation, and he can make that seat competitive in a way that nobody else who had been in the primary had been able to do to date. So again, one that's kind of new to the competitive seat radar screen, but one to pay attention to. I have heard mixed things from the business community in New Hampshire about both of them. Shaheen has not been as adversarial as some Democrats in other parts of the country, especially on some issues important to the state there. So depending on how Brown performs as a candidate, obviously he had been in Massachusetts, he's moved across state lines now to run in New Hampshire. I don't know how that plays with the voters there, if they see that as kind of carpetbagging, or if they say, hey, great, we're happy to have you, be our senator, dude. Who knows? So that's one that's still kind of digesting a little bit, and we'll see where it goes. But New Hampshire is another one that is going to be on people's radar screen for the time being, at least. The two places where Democrats are looking to pick up Republican seats are Georgia and Kentucky. Two very different situations. In Georgia, the Democrats again have cleared the field for Michelle Nunn, who is the daughter of former Senator Sam Nunn, enormously well regarded in the state. And Michelle Nunn has been the CEO of the Points of Light Foundation, which is a philanthropic group that was originally established by Colin Powell and others. And so she has no legislative record of votes to point to or against or anything else. She has an enormously well-liked political name in the state, and she's spent the last several years just sprinkling philanthropic fairy dust around and talking about all the good works that people do. She has demonstrated herself to be an enormously talented candidate, a very aggressive fundraiser, and the Republicans, meanwhile, have a bloodbath of a primary on their side. 6 different candidates, 3 members of Congress, one self-funder CEO, and a former statewide official female candidate, Karen Handel, former Secretary of State, and saw some polling on this just this morning. Everybody is bunched within about 5 points of each other. And you can imagine there are ideological differences, there are geographic differences, Atlanta-based candidates versus South Georgia candidates, and Tea Party versus establishment, and business versus, insider Washington versus outsider, and there's all sorts of different things going on there. Has the opportunity to be really, really bloody on the Republican side against a very, very talented Democrat opponent who, like I said, has a fantastic brand name in the state and has proven to be a very, very formidable candidate. Georgia has gone very heavily Republican at the presidential level over the last several years, but it's a changing state. The demographics are changing. And it's a state that the Democrats have invested heavily in over the last couple of years, the way that they did in Virginia first to turn Virginia from a reliably Republican state into a purple state, and then they did the same thing in North Carolina. They're now doing that same work in Georgia. So a great deal of investment and infrastructure on the Democrats' part to identify and turn out voters there, and it may be just the perfect storm that the Democrats are able to pick up a seat in a fairly reliably Republican state based on the dynamics there. The other one that the Democrats have their eye on is in Kentucky with Mitch McConnell, the current Republican Senate leader, and he's running against Allison Lundgren Grimes, who is the Secretary of State. As heavily Republican as Kentucky is at the federal level, at the presidential level, I mean, obviously they've elected her Secretary of State. They have a Democrat governor. So like Arkansas, it's a state that has a history of voting maybe Republican at the presidential level, but electing Democrats statewide at other levels. She, like Michelle Nunn, has demonstrated herself to be an enormously talented candidate. She's young, sharp, aggressive, smart, and the Secretary of State, again, sort of like Nunn, doesn't have a legislative record of votes that people can point to and pull apart one way or another. Meanwhile, McConnell is universally known, and he is the embodiment of Republicans in Congress, who, the last time I checked, had an approval rating in the low teens. And so the embodiment of the Republicans in Congress, which is not liked even by Republicans, is creating a real matchup. The polling in this has it dead even, and it's all about Mitch McConnell. Do you like him or do you not like him? And because you have a credible alternative, this is a race that is going to have an enormous amount of spending involved on both sides. Both sides are going to have enormous amounts of spending on behalf of the candidates, but also outside spending. And so it's the TV stations in Louisville and Lexington are going to be very, very happy at the end of 2014. So that's kind of the landscape as I see it. Like I said, on the Republican side to pick up, the numbers that they are looking at are 3, 6, 9, and 12. 6 seats to take over the majority in the Senate. 3 that they feel like they kind of have in the bag, and they need to pick up 3 of the additional 9 targets that they have, with 12 targets total. Democrats, meanwhile, have 2 that they feel like they have the opportunity to pick up, either of which truly could go their way, which would make the math on the Republican side of a pickup that much more difficult. So that's how we're kind of seeing it from where we sit. These, like I said, I mean, the situation continues to be very fluid. We've got an entire summer and fall to go through. The Republicans have demonstrated a strong history of shooting themselves in the foot over the last 2 election cycles. So who knows what's going to end up happening, but that's how I see things for right now.
Questions for Bo? It is ironic that the Republicans could take over the Senate, but the leader could lose.
Yeah.
That's just a strange thing. McConnell also has a primary against a Tea Party fella whose race is being run by consultants out of Pennsylvania.
Oh, really?
And so far, he has not really caught on, but McConnell now has to fight a war on 2 fronts.
That's true.
Makes it harder and more costly. Questions for Bo?
I was that thorough. Wow.
You were commenting a little bit more, if you will, on the state of the feud between, let's call it the establishment business side of the Republican Party and Tea Party, outsider, or insurgent, whatever you want to call the other side, or other party.
Well, actually, I had an article about this just the other day. That my sense is that there has been a co-opting of the Tea Party brand by a handful of kind of Washington groups that are the Senate Conservatives Fund, Club for Growth, Madison Project, Freedom Works, groups like that, who say we represent the Tea Party, we represent conservatives, and it's driven by Washington. And what is of interest to the people who are running those groups, not necessarily to the best interest of the people who created the Tea Party movement, who cared about lower taxes and reducing spending and government regulation. So those groups have targeted a handful of senators, including McConnell, with Matt Bevin in Kentucky. They had a couple of successes challenging Republicans that they felt were not sufficiently conservative. They did it to Bob Bennett in Utah. We now have Senator Mike Lee there, who challenged him in a primary, and the same thing in Indiana when Dick Lugar was defeated by Murdoch, who ended up not winning the general election. But they've done a lot of recruitment to try to find Tea Party-oriented candidates to run against most of these sitting Republican senators, and in most cases they have found people. I think Republicans are much more, or the current elected Republican senators are much more aware of that threat now that Lugar lost, now that Bennett lost, and others have been challenged, and they've taken steps to insulate themselves from some of those threats pretty effectively so far.
If you're a Republican senator in office today and you were elected in 2008, which was a good year for Democrats, so you had to be a fairly sharp campaigner. So they watched their compatriots in the 2010 and 2012 classes get mowed down by these folks. So they've had years to kind of prepare. And what I find interesting, having worked in some of those battles, is it's less issue-driven now and more kind of how you approach things.
It's much more tactical.
Outside or much more tactical. It's not like, boy, you voted wrong on X, Y, Z. It's you're not hardcore enough on X, Y, Z, and why are you even talking to the other side? So it's sometimes harder to flesh out in primaries because it's hard to put an attitude in a TV ad.
Right.
You could put in a TV ad, you voted the wrong way on this. When I ran Arlen Specter's campaign in 24 and we were challenged by then Congressman Cheney, it was all about him saying you voted wrong on these things and such. And now it's much more, you're not, upset enough or petulant enough or hardcore enough. So it's
Exactly right.
interesting to see how it fleshes out.
Right, but the more Tea Party candidates are elected, the more they're going to exacerbate the problem in Washington of the gridlock and not being able to get anything done. Because we still govern from the middle. So how does
They
that
don't think
vote?
that, though.
Right, but that is the case. I mean, you take the far left and the far right, and somewhere in the middle is where something gets done. And
Sometimes I
you know,
think legislating ought to be like diving, where they take out the best score and the worst score, and then you take the middle scores. If we could do that, maybe we'd lose some of the chat.
no, but so how does that vote for a presidential? Where do the Republicans go? How does that tent come together?
I am less sanguine than Bo about if the Republicans take control of the Senate, it'll help ease gridlock. I don't think the gridlock's going to change until the country has another national election in 2016 and figures out what way it's going to go.
Other questions? Let me flip that one. We were talking about Mary Landry and prior others. We have the same issue, obviously in state legislatures all around the country, but Pennsylvania, where you'll get some Democrats who, certainly by the standards of their caucus, are good for business, or the better ones for business. And maybe it's no coincidence that they're then in a district that in fact is a middle of the road district, so
Right.
winnable by Republicans. So I suspect I might have the same conversation I have with you, I have with Chris sometimes. Yeah, but the Republican will vote those 80% of the time, and the Democrats vote 60% of the time. And there's times I think, yeah, but keeping a couple of those 60%ers around in the Democrats, maybe it helps with others in the caucus, shows them the way. They're the ones who survive someday and become leaders. What's BIPAC's thinking, and how's the business community looking at that strategically to say, yeah, maybe Republicans can get that one, but should they?
Right. BIPAC is agnostic. Everything that we do, whether it's our endorsements or anything else, is driven kind of at the behest of our membership. And so, but what our membership typically sees is the latter, that we want to have people that we can work with on both sides of the aisle. And while yes, it might be possible if we were to go all out to beat Mary Landrieu, it's more important for us to have champions in the Democrat caucus than it is to obliterate anybody who isn't with us all the time. And so most of our membership, actively works to kind of seek people that they can work with on both sides of the aisle. And and a lot of things are not ideologically driven anyway. That it's something that's between industries. What the insurance companies want versus what the financial services companies want, and it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat necessarily. That if you've got heavy insurance representation in your state or district, then that's the way that you're going to vote. And if you've got heavy financial services operations in your state, then that's the way you're going to vote. And so, a lot of times it's things that are not necessarily Republican or Democrat or ideologically driven. It's more, regional or issue or something like that.
Questions?
Okay, thank you